All right, guys, so we're going to go ahead and get started by creating our homepage. So we're going to need an index HTML and an app CSS. So in the index HTML, we basically want a starter HTML5 template. In VS Code, you can do exclamation and then tab, and this will give you the scaffolding for an HTML file. So I'm going to change the title here to quick quiz. And I think that's good. So we're going to add a few different things in here. One that I forgot is actually a link to our CSS. So we'll need to add that. And this is called app CSS. So we'll change that from index to app CSS. So now we've got HTML file. We can add, let's just add an H1 here to test that this is working. And what we're going to do, or what I'm going to do, is I'm going to use something called the live server extension to open our application on local host, and it basically creates a live reloading server, which you'll see what that means in a second. So if you want this extension, under extensions, it is called live server here. So go ahead and install that, and then when you've got it, sometimes you get an option that pops up down here, but I can always right click and then do open with live server. So what this is going to do, and it actually opened on the wrong page for me, a wrong instance of Chrome. So let me bring this over here. And what this does, again, it started a localhost server actually on an IP here, and then at port 5500. And so as I start changing this to be quick quiz, if I change this and save, this is going to automatically refresh in our browser. So this is going to make it really easy for us to see the changes as we make them, and just kind of speed up our process. So that's what we're going to do. So I'm gonna scaffold out this HTML, and then we're gonna style it, and we're gonna finish up the home page in this video. So what I want, and as I'm doing this, I'm gonna give another note. So emit are snippets or abbreviations that you can use in HTML and CSS built into VS Code. If you've never used these before, definitely check out the emit docs, and I can pull open emit docs. I can pull open this here for you. So docs.emit.io. This is going to incredibly speed up your HTML and CSS development. So definitely check it out, and then just kind of follow what I'm doing if you can. If you've never done it, you might go do some practice, but you can pause the video and catch up if you need to. So by typing .container and then tab, this is an emit abbreviation to create a div with a class of container. If I did a hashtag of container, that would give me a div with an ID of container. So by default, your emit abbreviations are going to give containers, then you can, or excuse me, divs, and then you can give it classes or IDs, things like that. So speaking of IDs, inside of this, I'm going to have an ID called home, because this is going to be our home page. And then I'm going to give it a couple of classes, Flexbox helper classes that we're going to create in a second, and we'll talk about what Flexbox is. So this is going to have Flex Center and Flex column, and then I'll tab it over. So now I've got a div inside of my container div with an ID of home and a class of Flex Center and Flex column. Inside of here, I want to have an H1 that does say quick quiz, and then we'll also have a couple of anchor tags to link to other pages in our application. One, the actual game, so the play button, and then a high scores button to go and view the high scores. So what this is going to be is an anchor tag with an href to game HTML. And then we can also add some styling to this, and we're going to make it look like a button even though it is an anchor tag. So I just want to make a copy of this line, and then I'll change it from game to high scores, and then change the text here from game or play to high scores as well. So these are going to be two buttons that we'll see on our page. Obviously, this looks really terrible right now. And so we're going to open up our CSS file so we can start styling these things. But we've got all the HTML here that we need. We just need to go in and add support for all these classes and things like that. So in our app CSS, one thing I want to talk about is using rem in CSS. Now, rem gives you the ability to define your font sizes or margins and paddings relative to the root font size, basically. So if you change that root font size, anything using a rem will change accordingly as well. And I'll show you kind of exactly why we want to do this in a second. So you can read through some different articles on this. There's lots of content on it, but this is a pretty common thing that a lot of people use instead of pixels, for example, in this situation. So the way we're going to set this up is we're going to use our root selector, and that basically just becomes our HTML tag. We're going to set the background color to ECF5FF. And we should see a change here. It was very subtle. It's a very light color. It's almost a white, but it's got a little bit of blue in it. So that's going to be our background color. And then now we're going to change our font size to 62.5%. Now this looks really weird. The reason this is 62.5%, the default font size in most browsers is 16 pixels. So 62.5% of 16, if you do the numbers, is 10 pixels. So now the root size, the root font size is going to be 10 pixels. So anything that we reference with rems will be based on that 10 pixels. So we'll come back to that in a second. So the first thing I'm going to add is box sizing border box. Now what this means is if I add a border to a box, it's going to include the width of that border in the calculated size of that box. So if I have a box that's 40 pixels by 40 pixels and I add a 5 pixel border, without box sizing set to border box, that'll really make your square 50 by 50 instead of 40 by 40. So with border box, that means that the 40 by 40 is going to include your box sizing. So that's what we want. So we'll have that. Then we'll have just set some font family stuff, and we're going to use Arial, Helvetica, Sans Serif. Not going to get too fancy here. Then I want to reset basically all of the margin and padding. So we're gonna make sure that we control all of the margin and padding in our app. And then the text color that we're gonna use is 333. So the reason using text color a little bit off from black it can be pretty harsh. You probably won't see much of a difference here when I save. Well, you'll see the spacing change, and the color here is a little bit different. It's not as harsh as a pure black, so it's just something a little bit off. So I'm gonna copy in a few things. I'm going to set a default margin bottom for our H1 through H4 tags, and then I'm going to overwrite these a little bit. I'm going to copy in some of these styles so that you guys save a little bit of time coding them. You guys can see. So what we're doing is we're saying H1, the font size is going to be 5.4 rem, and rem again is going to be relative to that root font size. So this is basically going to be 5.4 times 10 pixels, which is 54 pixels. And then the color is going to be a blue color. And then we've got a margin bottom here. And then similar stuff. We'll come back to this span. That's going to be used later on, but I've kind of got it in here anyway. And then H2 is going to be 42 pixels. And then a margin of 40 pixels. Font weight is going to be bold. Or excuse me, not bold. H1 was bold. And then our H3 is going to be 28 pixels, font weight of 500. So when I save this, you'll see now this is going to refresh. This is going to be what our H1s are going to look like with this blue color. It's going to be pretty big. And then we still got to style our links down here. All right, so now I'm going to get into creating some of our, I call them utility classes. So usually in my CSS, I will leave a comment here and just type out utilities. And the first thing we're going to start with is container. Now this is going to be, the goal here is to provide some padding and provide some padding on the outside. But what we want to do is center all of our stuff basically in the screen. So we want this this to take up the entire view width. So this will make it 100% of the view width, and then the height will be 100 of the view height as well. So this is going to basically make it take up the entire page. And then we'll have display of flex, and we'll talk a little bit about Flexbox what Flexbox is here in just a second. With Flexbox, we've got justify content center and align items center. And I think if we save this, we'll go ahead and see a difference here. So with Flexbox, which is relatively new in CSS, centering things is incredibly easier than it used to be in the past. So what happened here is display flex turns this container into a Flexbox container. And then since it's taking up this entire height and width of the page, justify content will center things horizontally by default, and then align items will center things vertically by default. So if I started this, the align items to flex start, for example, that's going to pull things up to the top. If I undid that and did justify content flex end, for example, it's going to push everything to the right. So Flexbox is definitely something you'll want to spend some time with if you haven't before, but just know that these 3 lines allow me to center things horizontally and vertically. All right, and then my max width, I want to be 80 rem. So basically what I'm doing here is, let me do an inspect here and I'll show you. It looks like I've got a typo here, so this should be 80 rem with no space. Now if I select, so if you look at, if I hover over my container, see that it stopped at this 800 pixels, which is right about in here. And then it has this extra content to the right. So what I want to do is set a margin 0 auto to go ahead and center that content as well. So this will just kind of make sure that as my screen gets bigger, there will be some padding, but as it gets smaller, it will take up the entire screen with that 100 viewport width and viewport height, but still keep it centered. So that's all we're doing there, is really just trying to keep all of our stuff centered inside of our application. All right, and then on top of this, I'm gonna add any child of my container. I wanna make sure that its width is 100%, so that we can continue to style things, or excuse me, center things horizontally. So I'm gonna paste in just a few more styles here. You guys can grab them from the source code just to kind of speed this up a bit. So what I've got here is flex column will give you a flex box, and then it will set the direction to column. So typically, or by default, flex box direction is horizontal. Now we're flipping that direction to be vertical, so it's going to stack things on top of each other. Notice how play and high scores got stacked on top of each other. Flex center is going to align both justify content and align items to center. Justify center will just do justify content center. Text center will align things in the center, align text center, and then hidden will hide things if we need to, which we'll get to later on in the course. So just to kind of reinforce some of the things that you're saying, one, we've got that container, which is a flex box. It's going to center the main content of the page on the page. The home also has flex center and flex column, which means this is going to be a flex box with a vertical direction, so it's going to stack things on top of each other like this. And then it's got flex center, so it's centering all of that content as well. And then we've got our app name and then our 2 buttons. So the last thing we need to do is actually style our buttons. And so I'm going to come in and create a section with a comment called buttons. So I'm just going to paste in some of this button code and then I'll talk you through it. So we've got our class of button, and this is being applied to an anchor tag, but obviously we want to make it look like a button. So we've got a font size here with basically 18 pixels. We've got some padding. We've got a fixed width. We've got centered text. We've got a border here of 1 pixel, basically 0.1 rem. Got a margin bottom. You need to set text decoration to none because by default anchor tags are underlined, so we don't want that. Then we've got the color of the text and the background color. So save that and we'll see the buttons pop up and look pretty good over here on the right. And then also we've got a hover state. So in the hover state, we want to set the cursor to pointer. We'll add a drop shadow here. And we're still using that blue color to do that drop shadow with a little bit of transparency. And then we'll do a transform. So we're basically going to move this thing up just a bit. I guess that's 1 pixel. And then we'll do a transition. So we're going to not just jump to that position. We're going to let it transition over the course of a short period of time. So as I hover on these buttons, you can see that effect. Now, these are pretty common styles for hover effects. So you're almost always going to do your cursor as a pointer. A lot of people add drop shadows and then do a little tiny transform just to kind of give that nice little subtle effect. And then I want to show you at some point later on, we will have a disabled button. And that will come when we're looking to accept high scores. So we've created this for now. Basically what it's going to do is it's going to change the cursor. So instead of pointer, it's going to show something that basically says you can't click. And then it's not going to do that box shadow and transform. So we'll talk about that more when we get to that video. But for now, you can see we've got a pretty good looking homepage. These anchor links will work, but game HTML doesn't exist yet, and high scores HTML doesn't exist yet either. So that's going to do it for this first video. In the next one, we're actually going to go ahead and create our game page and go and scaffold out the layout of our game. So I will see you in the next one.